Okay, I gotta start off by saying, first off, if you already know how to just look at a building and know an Italianate from a Foursquare, or if you can just look at a building and know a Second Empire from a Queen Anne, you might want to check out the tax credit session because you're already going to know most of this stuff. But I did find when I was at other conferences that were comparable to this, that they didn't really go, they talked a lot about the modern movement, which is great. I mean, I'm starting to get this really new appreciation for it. But they weren't very clear on some of those earlier styles. Some of the styles that we all see in our communities, but may not know the nuances, may not know the little details that separates a Queen Anne from a Victorian vernacular. So that's what I'm here to do today, is to give you some of those clues that can help you visually identify those buildings. Now, it's my personal belief that a good preservationist starts at the city level. Or good preservation work starts at the city level. You need to understand what resources you have in order to develop good policy to deal with them. You need to understand what you have in order to advocate for preservation in your community. You need to understand what you have to understand how to write an RFP, a request for proposal, to get the architects and to get the technical preservationists on board to help you out with these works. If you're writing an RFP, you want to be able to specify, we have this great Italianate building. You don't just want to say we have this old building that we need help with. And that's really what I'm here to do today, is to sort of make those differentiations. But also the final thing, promotion. If you think about your communities and think about heritage tourism, you want to be able to say in your promotional materials, we have this great Victorian district that features Queen Anne's and vernacular buildings. You want to be able to kind of specify exactly what you have. So, and I wasn't able to find the clicker. Do you know? Sorry. Otherwise, I'll just come up here and do it like. That'll work.
I think I see it right in the front here in the render. There's a little.
Aha, there we go. Okay, got it. Today we're not going to be able to touch on every single architectural style that's ever existed ever in the Midwest. We don't have the time, and I really wanted to focus on the ones that when I was doing this as a consultant, the ones that I kind of saw most consistently in Minnesota communities and other Midwestern communities. So we're going to take a look at 4 distinctive architectural eras. And the first one is Pre-Victorian. This is also called the Railroad era. It runs from about the 1840s to the 1870s, so very early in Minnesota's history. We'll take a look at the Victorian period, you know, those high-style grand homes that every city kind of likes to feature. And that takes us from approximately the 1870s to the 1900s, very early 1900s. The arts and crafts movement, which started its genesis in the early 1900s, ended up going around the 30s, somewhat into the 40s. And we'll take a very brief look at the mid-century modern, the 1940s on. But we're not going to spend a ton of time on those because we've already had 2 extremely great sessions on modernism and some of the nuances in there. And I think I saw some of you guys in that last session. So they went into a lot more detail than what I'm going to go into. So those are the eras that we're going to take a look at. And I'm going to do what I do with a lot of my students. Most of my students come in and they haven't had architecture classes before. So what I try to do is give them 3 or 4 main clues that can help them identify buildings in the field. And you can kind of keep those as a list, kind of keep that in your pocket as you're walking around your communities. First thing you got to know about architecture when you're first starting to look at the styles, the architects don't like to play by the rules. They love taking a little bit of Tudor, mixing it with a little bit of Craftsman. They love taking a little bit of Second Empire and mixing it with Queen Anne. You take a look at these 3 buildings, and all 3 of these are the same architectural style. Now you can see that they are vastly different from one another. You've got the Second Empire in Mankato, Minnesota, which is now a veterinary clinic. You got the Second Empire in Salem, Massachusetts, and the Second Empire in Jacksonville, Illinois. Now, for those of you, maybe I did have one of you as a student once, so what is a common element between these 3 buildings that make them the same style?
Roof line.
Yeah, the mansard roof, the roof line. And because we know that a mansard roof is associated with that Second Empire style, we can clearly say that these are all of the Second Empire style of architecture, even though they look vastly different. Now, I wanted to also touch on the concept of pattern books, vernacular versus high style. In the 1840s, 1850s or so, what we found was there was this guy, Andrew Jackson Downing, came up with this great idea. Why do we have to hire individual architects to design individual buildings for individual homeowners? It gets expensive, it gets difficult to manage, and frankly, a lot of homeowners were looking for more efficient ways to build their houses. So he came up with this concept of the pattern book, the Architecture of Country Houses, published in 1850. This was essentially like a catalog of home plans. You could look through this catalog, pick out your house, send away for the plans, and if you had enough money, you could maybe send away for the materials too. And there you go. This was a great way to perpetuate the styles throughout the country. It meant that we no longer had, well, I don't want to say no longer entirely had, but it meant that there was a definite lessening of regionalism in our architecture. We could have the same Gothic Revival house in Minnesota that you would find in Atlanta. I mean, this is a way to kind of create an American vernacular instead of kind of this regional look. And I don't want to say that there aren't regional differences in how we build these things. There are. But it did kind of create a bone structure of American architecture. And I should say that we are still using this concept of the pattern book today. You go to Menards, I think Home Depot might have something like this. You can pick your house out. You can build that house on a lot of land that you enjoy. You get your floor plans. I actually haven't purchased a house this way, so I don't know if they'll send you the materials and everything too. But it is a way to sort of have a say in your house without having to hire an architect to specifically design it for you. This promoted what we like to call the vernacular form. It meant that we were working with a set of plans that could be shared amongst communities instead of having what we refer to as high style. For my students, I usually define high style as like the biggest and best of the style. Typically that means that an architect was hired to design a specific house for a specific client. So that's how we differentiate that, or at least that's how I differentiate that. Those of you who are dealing with this quite a bit may define that a little bit differently. The pattern books are one of the main ways that all the styles that we talk about today, that's not true, most of the styles we talk about today are going to be sort of shared amongst the United States. And so we begin with some of the earlier forms, the pre-railroad, the pre-Victorian railroad era styles. First one we're going to take a look at, Gothic Revival. Now this one was great for especially rural properties. Typically what you had was a very wide house that wasn't particularly deep unless the individual homeowner wanted it to be. Now, like I said, I usually pick out about 3 or 4 main elements that kind of define that style. And typically what we would find in the Gothic Revival is a side gable configuration, meaning that the V of the gable, the main door is under the long part of the roof line. So in this case, in this example, we've got the long part of the roof line, but it's interrupted by our second identifying feature, the steeply pitched centralized gable. Now, taking a look at that, pretty easy to see where the influence is. This was meant to sort of resemble a steeple, some sort of a Gothic spire element that comes all the way back from the Dark Ages to show up on our American vernacular houses. That steep gable was kind of the identifying feature of this style. This is what people looked at to create that visual interest, that stylized oomph on the property. And often they would decorate that steep gable with some sort of a Gothic style window. It could be that pointed arch window, it could be that trefoil or multi-petaled window. Didn't really matter what style of window you wanted, but it did create that visual interest, that sort of that visual standout property. Now, okay, so we mentioned the third point, the decorative window. Sometimes people would decorate the gables with some sort of barge board or verge board, that gingerbreading that you find underneath the eaves of some of these buildings. unfortunately, that's been taken off because it was hard to maintain. I mean, it's very expensive to recreate. So we don't see a lot of original examples of that anymore. But if you do find one, document it, because that's a good thing to find. That's a good thing to have on there. So here's just some examples of the Gothic head window, some of the decorative features on a Gothic revival. You can see that they're sort of imitating a spire, almost. And I also wanted to mention, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free. We're not going to do a formal Q&A session at the end, so just go ahead during the session. Now, I would imagine that working for cities, a lot of the preservation and the historic buildings that you're looking at are going to be downtown traditional forms. And these are some examples of how the Gothic Revival form has been translated onto the traditional narrow lot commercial building. Typically, of course, the lower levels, as you all probably know, they tend to get renovated. We talked about slip covers, and we talked about some of the modernizations in the last session. But if you look on the upper levels, we have a lot of those distinctive features that we saw on the residential property. The arched window, this is the nice quatrefoil window. Arched windows that kind of extend that arch a little bit with a decorative element above it, decorative hooding. And again, the arched window form. I gotta admit, in the field, I've never seen a Gothic Revival traditional Gothic Revival commercial. They don't tend to be very frequent because there's another style that tends to be more well embraced. I'm not sure why, if that was just a fashionable choice, but the Italianate tended to be a little bit more dominant in commercial design, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to point out some of the features of the Italianate style properties. Sure, your communities have these. These are very, very popular. These were pattern book styles. There are high style examples all over the place. But you take a look at them, and they do have kind of a squared off look. They have a very boxy floor plan. And that box can be elongated. It can be widened. You can add wings to it. It doesn't really matter how you play with it. But the main form does tend to be very square. But one of the more telling features of this building is the use of the hip roof. The roof that you can see the roof line on all four sides. It doesn't have a huge overhang. And that's one of the ways you can tell it from later forms. The eaves just kind of hug the building. They aren't completely streamlined, but they do tend to be rather close in. And then underneath that rather shallow eave, you've got some very high style decorative bracketing. And you can see an example of that here, and here actually. The bracketing, this was a great way to put some art on your building. The Italianate form is very simple, but you stick that bracketing under those eaves and it gives it that higher level of artistic merit. It gives it that higher level of visual interest and creates what looks like a high style building, even if you have a vernacular form. This particular building in St. Peter, this is on the National Register. This is the Montgomery House. And you can see how they used that bracketing to create one of the main visual features on the building. They actually paired the brackets and alternated them with some smaller brackets. Anybody could do that though. I mean, this isn't something that's exclusive to the high style. You could go into a dry goods store and maybe order some pre-made ones. Probably came a little bit later, but you might even be able to get some mass-produced ones. So the bracketing really is one of the defining features, and we do find this on a number of Italianate houses. We do have original bracketing on some. This building, this one also comes from St. Peter. Another telltale feature, and honestly, this isn't exclusive to the Italianate. It happens to be on several other styles, but the hooding is a little bit different. The Italianate window tends to be very tall and narrow. If you're on the interior of the building, you do find that it goes almost floor to ceiling. I mean, these are very tall, very beautiful multi-pane windows. But the distinctive feature of them are these window hoods. You've got different styles of window hoods, but they do tend to sort of highlight that window, give it a little bit more length, give it a little bit more emphasis, and create some of when you pair it with the brackets, it creates that visual interest on that building. Italianate commercial tends to be one of the most popular commercial vernacular styles. I mean, we can see examples of it, I believe, in Faribault. Probably your downtowns have a ton of these. Anybody recognize these from your downtown area? I've seen a few heads nodding. The features that made it a very prominent style in the residential are also translated onto the commercial vernacular. So again, the tall, narrow windows with the decorative hooding. And then, even though we don't have a hipped roof, you still see that decorative bracketing. You still have those repeating forms that create that interesting cornice line, that give it that Italianate form. This is a more freestanding hipped roof version, but this is more typical of what you'll see. At the arched windows with the heavy hooding and the bracketing. Any questions so far? Okay, like I was saying, you don't always have to have just one style on a building. You're going to find bracketing on Second Empires, you're going to find bracketing and window hoods on Italianates and Second Empire. We've already looked at this style though. Seriously, you see a mansard roof and you can almost universally put it in the Second Empire style. And when we say the mansard roof, what that means is the roof line that comes down over that third story of the building. Now, this may be mythology, but I've heard that some people used to use it as kind of a tax loophole. Now again, I have to research this because I only recently heard it and I don't want to say something that's going to make me have to retract later. But according to legend, they used to tax you on the number of usable floors in your building. And so the mansard roof was a way to sort of get around that. They wouldn't tax attic levels because they weren't considered usable. You didn't have a ton of windows as you saw in the Gothic Revival and the Italianate. And so by putting the mansard roof down a little lower, you'll notice how steep that roof line is. That's usable floor space. That is usable to rent out, it's usable to live in. Suddenly you have you're being taxed as a one-story house, but you have 2 stories that you can actually use. You have a 2-story house with a mansard roof, and you got 3 stories. So that's just kind of an interesting little legend about the Second Empire. But it was also reflective of the people's interest in all things French at the time. It was very stylish. It was based on these French country homes. But the mansard roof, that roof that has either a flat deck like you see on here, or a kind of hip deck like you can see on here, and extends down, that is the key element of the Second Empire. And it can be translated into a commercial form. The commercial form does use the mansard roof, but it might only use it on the front. Because as we all know, the commercial lots in a traditional downtown, they're kind of squishy. They don't have a whole lot of space around them, usually no side yards. So you kind of got to do with what you got. So you'll find it mostly on the front. Again, you'll see these windows very Italianate in their styling. I mean, we associate those type of windows with the pre-railroad. We don't associate them specifically with Italianate or specifically with Second Empire, because both don't use it. Another thing that I find fascinating about the mansard roof, and I'll just go back here, notice the patterning that you can do with the shingles. Most roofs, you don't do that because you don't really see the roof. It's not something to pay attention to. But by bringing that mansard roof down, you can play with the form. You can have multicolored shingles, you can have stripes, and you can have diamonds, and you can do all sorts of really great things with them. Unfortunately, as these buildings have been renovated, of course, people have not done that. They've kind of created their own design of one color, one shingle style. It's more economically feasible to do so, of course, but when you're doing preservation or you're doing a restoration of these buildings, if you find evidence that there was some patterning on the mansard roof, that is a great way to sort of bring it back to its original glory. So you can see that in this commercial building up here. You can see the shingle patterning. So again, the mansard roof. You see it, Second Empire. Always make that association. Now, as we find ourselves moving closer to the Victorian period, as we find ourselves getting into this whole industrial revolution, these captains of industry who are making millions of dollars overnight. Okay, there's some of that in Minnesota, but in this case, we're looking at buildings in St. Peter. So we've got thousandaires overnight. We were starting to see the houses get a little bit bigger. We were starting to see them become more ornate. And one of the things that always strikes me is taking a look at these properties, at the Italianates, even the Gothic Revival. Notice what a nice balance there is. If you drew an axis of symmetry down the middle of them, both sides would be relatively the same. So during the pre-railroad era, we do see a lot of symmetry in the building. And then that all goes to hell once we get to the Victorian period. The Victorians were not going to be bound by these rules of symmetry. They were not going to be bound by these rules of Renaissance design. They're going to take it to the next level. They're going to show people how much they succeeded in life by building these multi-story, usually 2- or 3-story buildings with turrets and towers and bay windows and wraparound porches and these decorative half-moon windows all over the place. So trying to pick out the 3 features to know about a Victorian building, specifically this style, the Queen Anne, it's very difficult. So here's the kind of lowdown on it. They love to use multiple roof styles. So you're going to have a mixture of gable and hipped. You're going to have mansard roofs in there somewhat, but there really is rarely going to be just one roof style on that building. So in this case, we've got the Schumacher House, which is on the National Register. You've got a mixture of the gable, you've got a hipped roof with a small gable projection. You've got the conical roof on the tower. Over here, this is not on the registry that I'm aware of. You've got the hipped roof with the gable, and again here we've got a hipped roof with gable, and both of these have the tower as well. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's a roof line that sort of promotes the sense of freedom, of not being bound by the old traditional architectural rules. So that is one of the most telltale stylistic elements of the Queen Anne. And of course, the high decoration. Anywhere you can stick decoration on a Queen Anne, they're going to try to do it. That means wraparound porches with these amazing spindles, with these very decorative balustrades. Actually, can we shut off the lights so we can see some detail? I'll get it. But taking a look at those porches, that's where a lot of people wanted to focus their detail. There, that's a little bit better. And that use of decoration is carried out from the bottom of the porch to the top of the porch, the wraparound features. Even if it didn't have a wraparound porch, it's still going to be pretty ornate. As you go up the building, you'll often find the windows are going to be a little bit more decorative. There's often going to be decorative hooding on there. I'm going to say often, but not 100% of the time, because somebody's always going to have an exception. They'll want a stained glass window instead of a hood. It's a personal choice. And again, in the gable ends, the open part of the gable, that's where you're going to find a lot of that high style decoration. You're going to find brickwork that's just amazing. You're going to find the stick work, all that wood, those wooden slats that are arranged in like these sunburst patterns. It's very, what's the word I want to use? What's that?
Eclectic.
Very eclectic, thank you, yeah. It's a stylistic choice. It kind of shows the expressiveness of the architect and the homeowner. So I always tell my students, look at the gable ends, because that's where the best stuff is going to be. Unfortunately, a lot of people have taken the work out of the gable ends because it does get expensive to maintain, especially if you have kind of a free-standing decorative element like that. But if it's brickwork, if it's stick work, it's going to be there somewhere. So hopefully you can see traces of it. And again, in the roofs, you're going to get the amazing shingle work. Stripes, diamonds, these fish scale patterns, anything you can imagine. So the Queen Anne is really the high expression form of the Victorian period. But you know, there's stuff that other incomes can adapt, and we'll take a look at those in just a moment. But I wanted to point out some of the more telling features of not just the Queen Anne, but of other Victorian styles. And the first one is the use of porch posts. In the pre-Victorian railroad era, we tended to stick with kind of the Greek columns, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian forms. But in the Victorian period, we're getting away from that a little bit. Instead of using those classical columns put together by that drum and post system, we're starting to use what's called the turned post. The turned post is exactly what you think. You've got the post on a lathe, and you kind of carve out these neat little bumps and grooves and everything, and then you can paint them up to sort of match your style. So the turned post gives the Victorian homes a sort of lighter feel. I mean, those Greek columns, they're great, you can do a lot with them, but they are very heavy. It's a very heavy style. But now, look at how much lighter those porches look by having those little narrow wooden posts instead of these big heavy ones. So we got that going on. The other thing you're going to notice are these windows. Oh, the windows are fabulous. The Victorians, when they could afford to do so, would put just these elaborate stained glass configurations on the windows. Typically, they would be the double hung sash, or I'm sorry, just the sash windows. And you would have stained glass work somewhere, typically on the upper. The lower would be oftentimes just the plain plate glass and lets a lot of natural light in. But then by adding a little bit of stained glass, you get a little bit of color in the room, adds that extra level of artwork. That idea of having the artwork on the upper aspect of the window is carried through with one of the more distinctive windows of the era, the cottage window. Oh, the cottage windows are great. They would be mainly on the lower floors because this would be kind of the window to the world. But I've seen them on a couple upper floors. It's this large square plate glass window with some sort of secondary window above it. Now it could be just empty, it could be just a window, but many people would put these stained glass patterns on that upper part. Gives the interior space a little extra color, a little extra artwork, gives the exterior a little bit of extra design, because we all know that the Queen Anne, they just love that form. So the cottage window, we see those on the Queen Anne, but they're also going to be on some later forms that we'll take a look at in a moment. Okay, the Queen Anne commercial. This one's often a little bit harder to determine. When you're looking at a traditional downtown with those narrow lots, with the kind of narrow storefronts, we see a lot of decoration on there. We see a lot of high-level design. But it is, in a lot of cases, like a slip cover. The buildings behind them are often just, brick boxes that have been gussied up with some sort of cast iron storefront. In a true Queen Anne design, you're going to be able to see Queen Anne all the way through. You're going to see the multiple roof lines. In a traditional downtown, we don't see that a whole lot. So typically we consider those more a vernacular form that it's just been dressed up with a slip cover. But we do have some cases of true Queen Anne designs. You've got the Clarksville Custom House. This is the Hotel Florence in Illinois. A big story behind Pullman. And Brunswick, Georgia. And those multiple roof lines, very obvious. The high level of decor that we just talked about, also very obvious. You can see some porches, you can see the window surrounds, the dormers sticking out of the roof. Towers and turrets and cupolas are very common. So again, you focus a lot of the artwork on a commercial Queen Anne on the upper levels and if possible on the porches. Seriously, a true Queen Anne commercial, in my experience, I haven't seen a ton of them because it is mostly the slip cover over the narrow, the deep lots. So if you have one of these, does anybody have one of these in your community? Well, if you do, if you think you recognize one, please let me know because I'd love to get an original picture to use that's local. Now these are probably something you recognize as well. I mean, you might live in them, you probably see them all over in your community. This too is a Victorian form, but this is a form that most people could afford. Those Queen Annes, you had to have a little bit of money to have them. You had to have just a little bit of status in the community. But the typical Victorian home is going to come from a pattern book. I mean, you're going to open it up, find something you like, and order away for plans. And we call that Victorian vernacular or some people call it folk Victorian. I mean, it kind of means the same thing. This is a very common configuration of the Victorian vernacular, and that's called the gable L. It's very simple. You just have a gable that goes one way, a gable that goes the other. It comes together, looks like an L. I mean, it's pretty easy to figure out how they named that. These are some just common forms that I found around Minnesota and St. Peter, Jordan. This is in Mankato. Now, what would typically happen is people would see those Queen Anne styles and say, okay, I may not be able to afford this big honking house that dominates over my neighbors, but I can have some of the stuff. I can have these fancy porches, and I can have something in my gable end. And so they were able to buy the turn posts, they were able to buy the spindle work, they were able to put in sometimes even a cottage window. So they were able to take the elements of a Queen Anne without having the expense of it. And it just was able to come together on a very modest scale. Most of the time the elaborations are going to be focused on the porch, which is in the crook of the L, and in that gable end. Now I wanted to point this out. Most of the gable L's that you're going to see in your communities have been redone. Because these are affordable homes, a lot of people didn't want the expense of having to redo that porch in its original form. And so you'll find that in order to increase floor space, in order to just have a less maintenance porch, they're going to take off the turn posts, they're going to take off the spindle work, and either enclose it or put just a regular overhang. So what I did with a property in Mankato is took the original building and photoshopped a few elements on there to show what it might have looked like in its original form. So I know it's not the best Photoshop job, it's one of my early efforts, but it does show the value of looking beyond what's there and trying to think of what was supposed to be there. What might my community look like if we got everybody all fired up about preservation and restoration and adaptive reuse? So even the simplest Victorian vernaculars can look fantastic. So those are just some examples of that nature. Got it. But that's not the only thing. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Just for a second, the Jordan, Minnesota picture, how the roof line goes back in. Is there a name for that particular feature?
This feature
Yes.
here, that is broken pediment. Broken pediment, and it is kind of a decorative feature. You're not going to find it on all of them. It was found most often on like classical revival, Greek revival buildings. So they kind of fancied it up a little bit more. So yeah, the homes in Jordan, they have actually a lot of really good brick for Victorian vernacular. So if you're ever down that way, just go to downtown. Now, like I was saying, the gable L isn't the only Victorian vernacular form. You also have the front gable. And remember how at the start of the session I said the side gable is when the front door is under the long part of the roof? Front gable is just the opposite. In the front gable, the doorway is underneath the gable junction. So you're not going to see much of the roof itself on a front gable house. And again, these are probably homes that you've seen a million times. These are all over our communities. But they really have undergone a lot of, I don't want to say disruption, because honestly adding square footage to a house is usually considered a good thing. But when you're a preservationist, you take a look at some of the porch enclosures and how they've rerouted some of the entrances, and you're just kind of like, oh, that just kills my heart. In these cases, they have done a good job bringing these buildings back. So with the front gable, you've got a single roof style, the gable. The decoration, much like on the gable L, is going to be focused on the porch and the gable ends. You could usually afford to get some turn posts, you could afford to get a little bit of birch board or barge board at your local dry goods store. Oftentimes you would find a cottage window if people had a little extra money. But mostly the decoration is going to be focused on that porch and gable end. And I don't want to say it's entirely universal, but what I found typically would happen is that the porch would extend across the front of the entire building. So you might find a good wraparound porch on a front gable building, but it's pretty rare. Typically they're just going to be along that front. And this particular building is from the Milwaukee Avenue district in Minneapolis. Has anybody been through there? Okay, what do you guys think, just as preservationists? mean, that is just amazing. You look at pictures from the original Milwaukee Avenue district, and then you walk through and compare them. They did a spot-on job. Does anybody know offhand who did that work?
Bob Roscoe. Well, Bob Roscoe was involved in saving it.
Okay.
But I don't know if he did the actual work.
Okay, I'm forgetting offhand, but whoever did it should be congratulated because they were spot on, even in the gable end detail. It's pretty amazing. Now, when we talk about our downtown commercial buildings, those of you from Minneapolis, this probably doesn't really pertain to you, but for most of us who are coming from smaller communities, well, smaller than Minneapolis anyway, we do see a lot of these buildings. And like I was saying, you'll find some details on them that look like they could be Queen Anne. They have definitely that fancy level of design. But if you stripped off some of these sort of, and I don't want to say superficial because it has such the wrong connotation, but if you took off the decoration on the cornice, if you took off some of the posts, if you took off the decoration on the kick plate here, you would pretty much just have a brick box. But by adding those elements, by adding that facade, that sort of false front, it dresses the building up and makes it look like what we associate with our traditional downtowns. But if we go outside here, you're going to find some commercial Italianate, you're going to find some commercial classical revival, but you will find a lot of vernacular, a lot of false fronts. It was kind of handy, you know, you had the pattern books again, and commercial property owners could look through and find a great little storefront that they can put on the front of their building. Fabulous. It cost them less than having an architect come in and design it specifically for them, and they have this great looking building. So you've got a few things that you had to have on your commercial buildings with the Victorian commercial vernacular. Large display windows. Not a lot of advertising dollars going out at that point. So the way that you attract your customers, again, walking down the street, they see something awesome in your window. I mean, it's got to be bright and shiny and all interesting to them. And they would just find themselves wandering into your store. That was the hope. So you had to have those large plate glass windows. They were absolutely essential. That recessed door came in handy for a few reasons. Of course, putting the recessed door in underneath the little overhang gave you just a couple minutes to kind of shake off your umbrella, take off your overcoat, wipe off your galoshes. But what other reason, what other purpose do you think that recessed door has?
More window space.
Bingo. More window space. It's not a ton of window space, but when you're approaching the building from whichever direction, you see not only what's like right beside you, but you also have that peripheral vision of whatever they're displaying over here. So it's not a ton of extra window space, it's not a ton of extra advertising for your business, but it just gives you enough. It gives you that extra second to try to catch that customer. So it was a very deliberate ploy to make sure that that commercial business gets you in there. One thing that I do tell my students though is whenever you see one of these older buildings, look up. Most of the time we find slip covers over the first stories at least. We find that the windows have been boarded up. We find that the original kind of advertising area has been changed somehow. But even in the 40s and 50s, there were some people who kind of left that upper cornice alone. And so we'll see a lot of business names in this upper level. We'll see dates of the buildings, and it's very handy. So you probably already know this, but look up. Look past that new facade that they put on those buildings. Yes, sir?
Going back to the residential, is the distinction between vernacular and Queen Anne just a degree, extent?
Typically, the distinction between the Queen Anne and the Victorian vernacular, notice the lack of that multiple roof line. Vernacular forms tend to have a single roof line, like a gable. It's not going to be a mixed hipped and gable roof. So it's going to be a much simpler form, a more modest form that most people could afford. So, does that answer your question? I think that's probably the most telltale of the ways to tell the difference, because both of them are going to have elaborate porches. Of course, the Queen Anne ones, those are going to be made special for the client. These ones are going to be more like the Home Depot of the Victorian era. before we go on?
I have a question about the Jordan house, which I, with things that broken pediment and much need to eat, and the brick, very rectangular brick, hoods above the windows, which is part of stone. I would not put that in Victorian. You're doing that to cause the roof line.
Typically,
Okay.
that's why I did, but you know what, I don't know when this building was built because I didn't go to City Hall and look at the records. And this is a style that could have been built in the 1900s as well, the early 1900s. The Victorian vernacular form didn't die off just because of the turn of the century. It kept on because it was an affordable, usable style. So that's why I put that in there, because it reflects that gable L. It's very typical. But you know, it could be 1915 for some reason. So that's one of the reasons why I start off by saying the architects don't like to play by the rules. They don't switch over to arts and crafts just because we've entered that era. I mean, even today, like the previous speaker was saying, we still see colonial revival being built. So we do like to carry over our styles quite a bit. There are some styles, though, that we very clearly associate with the Victorian period, particularly the later Victorian period, and that is the Beaux-Arts. And of course, when you say that, you have to use your snootiest French accent. It is the Beaux-Arts. This one is very clearly identified with Renaissance design. Typically, it's going to have a flat roof or a very, very shallow pitched roof. It's going to be a wider building than it is tall. And again, I don't want to say 100% of the time, but that does tend to be the look to it. But I think one of the most, well, I'll let you guys pick it up. What do you think the dominant feature on this one is?
Arches.
Oh, it's got to be the arches. They're huge. They don't like to limit them just to one story. They like to really expand on those arches. Even if you only have one-story windows here, this is the Art Center in Mankato. The actual arch in between the pilasters goes up about 2 levels. It's very subtle, but it's there. The Red Wing Post Office, which I think is a great example of the Beaux-Arts, that too features those dominant arches. And you're going to alternate the arches with these grand classical columns. The turret post, not so much a Beaux-Arts style. You're going to use the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian forms that we find all the way back to ancient Greece. So Roman style arches, Greek and Roman columns, flat to very shallow pitched roof. Now, how many of you have these kind of buildings in your communities? Okay, yeah, Minneapolis. Now, you sir, you said you have.
Red Wing.
Oh, you are Red Wing, so you're familiar with this
Picture
one.
form than it does in real life.
Oh, you know, the lighting and stuff has probably been altered. But what kind of preservation efforts have you done with this particular building?
But this particular building,
Yeah.
nothing that I'm aware of. At least the last 10 years. There was some work done on the front steps, but that's what they said.
Okay. So, do you know if it's on the National Register?
I do not.
Okay.
One of the things that was added was an incline access from the left side, so wheelchairs.
Oh, great. So it's been adapted for ADA then. Good. Okay. That's always a good thing in historic buildings, because you want everybody to be able to access them. So just based on what you were saying, this is a good effort or a good example of how the owner/caretaker has been able to really get involved in keeping that building how it is. I mean, obviously we have some newer windows, we have a modern door, so it's not perfect. It's not perfectly preserved, but that might be something that could be reversed eventually if funding was ever available for it. And in Minneapolis, you said you had some too. Probably a lot of it. Got an example specific?
I was thinking also of a recent adaptive reuse of a post office building. It's a federal building now, but they are, or it's not an adaptive reuse, I guess. They're doing an accessibility alteration to an entrance to try and make it accessible. So, yeah, I can't think of a lot where you're seeing major additions or real extreme makeovers. It's the stone and the arches and things like that don't seem to lend itself as well to extreme makeovers. It's
Right.
smaller.
There's not as much room for that. So one of the things that I should point out, we don't see this in vernacular form too much. This tends to be a very high-style building, so you're not going to find a lot of Beaux-Arts in pattern books. The Beaux-Arts is kind of one of those specialty designs that came out of the Beaux-Arts school, the École de Beaux-Arts school over in France, carried back to the United States, sort of made its grand debut right around the World's Fair, Chicago World's Fair, 1893. But one of the biggest advocates of this style, Andrew Carnegie, one of those bigwig Victorian folks, you know, he was a great philanthropist. You're all probably aware of that. And he wanted to spread literacy, he wanted to donate towards libraries to be built all over the nation. But when they were designing the buildings, they tended to be very Beaux-Arts in their style. And so a lot of communities, large, small, rich, poor, had Carnegie libraries. Whether they were the big, grand, massive buildings like this, or whether they were much more modest in their form, you may run into these buildings in smaller communities as well. Another architectural form of the Victorian period that didn't really make it into a vernacular form is the Richardsonian Romanesque. And frankly, I love this form because it's very easy to tell from everything else. The thing is stone. I mean, this is a big old stone fortress. There is no mistaking this. It usually sits on Queen Anne bones. I mean, you have the multiple roof lines in the residential form. You have the elaborate porches and the decorative gable ends. But if you notice the columns on those buildings, if you notice the turrets and the towers, and even some of the decorative banding, they're going to be carved stone. You might have some copper accents in there, but mostly it just looks like a big old castle. So the Richardsonian Romanesque, it didn't really reach that vernacular form because it was a very expensive thing to build. I mean, all of this had to be carved out. It had to be sort of stylized to the property owner. And so this tended to be kind of the style of the wealthy at this time. So the stone is probably the number one clue that you're looking at, Richardsonian Romanesque. The wall cladding, the decorative details, everything is going to be stone. They do tend to use classical elements on the Richardsonian Romanesque. You've got the Roman arches, you've got the columns that have kind of this Roman/Byzantine look. You've got spindles and all sorts of these real classical elements that you might see on a Greek or Roman temple, rendered in stone, put on the building. So, great old building. I mean, these were very elaborate, very detailed works. And a lot of them have been translated into public/commercial buildings. So you can see some examples from Winona. Anybody from Winona? Okay, so you know this building. This is obviously in your downtown area.
Yeah, former bank, laundromat, long time sitting there for sale. I know the young people who live in the apartment right above there. It's right. And our courthouse, of course.
Yeah. So this particular building has some great Richardsonian Romanesque details. The cladding itself, that's brick, if I'm interpreting this correctly.
It is brick.
Yeah, but what's that?
It's brick, not stone.
Yeah, but the detail work, those large arches, the details over the windows, that's why I classify it as Richardsonian Romanesque, because the dominant features are that stone, that rough cut stone. Lots of towers used in these buildings.
What would it be called if it was like that, no stone? I mean, we have, in our town, we have what we call the Red Castle. And it's got the turrets, it's all made of red brick though. It's got the turrets, it's got almost like a fortress style. I think that's what we call it, is the fortress style. But it looks more like this, but there's no stonework, it's all brickwork.
Does it have the big heavy arches and kind of the classical columns?
Yeah.
That would be a tough one to classify. Richardsonian Romanesque can be masonry, as we see here, but usually there is some stone detail to it. So I'm almost wondering if it's not like, maybe a Richardsonian/Queen Anne hybrid. I'd be interested in seeing a picture of that, actually. I'm having difficulty
You go on to the Minnesota Historical Site Picture Library, you put in Litchfield, Minnesota, and and it was Senator Hanson's home. It'll come up. You can see it on there.
I'm going to check that out, because some of these buildings do get very difficult to classify when you've got all of the features of one, except for like the main feature that it's supposed to have. So I'm hesitant to say that it's Richardsonian Romanesque, but I have seen brick and very smooth stone Richardsonian Romanesque. So I'd like to see it before I can classify
Yeah,
it.
go on Minnesota's
Yeah.
website.
But what I find fascinating too is that for all of these classical features, you've got something like in Eureka Springs that doesn't have any arches at all. It doesn't have the classical columns, but it has the stonework. And so I put it under Richardsonian Romanesque because of its cladding, but it might be like the Red Castle, where it has all of the features, but can you really classify it as the particular style? That's why I say architects kind of like to mess with your mind a little bit. They like to throw in all these details. They like to make something their own. But yeah, that's why I put this particular building under Richardsonian Romanesque, because it does have that rough stone cladding. And then, of course, Minneapolis City Hall. Fabulous example of Richardsonian Romanesque. One of the things that is typical of commercial Richardsonian Romanesque that we don't find in residential as much is the symmetry, the balance of both sides. So even though we can tell if it's residential or commercial just based on its use, that symmetry is something kind of unique to the commercial forms. And that's not the case, obviously, in the Winona building, but in the other examples and in examples all over the rest of the country, we do tend to find commercial symmetry. Now, moving a little bit further on in history, just to make sure that we get you out of here in time for lunch, we move into the 1900s. And like I said, the Victorian style didn't die off just because we changed the calendar over, but we do find that there's kind of a major shift in mindset into how we're building these buildings. Just kind of jumping ahead, taking a look at Tudor forms, taking a look at craftsmen, and I'm not sure why it's making a noise now, sorry about that. Looking at this. That's great, we got a laser in here. What do you notice stylistically that's changing between the Victorian era and what's going on here?
The chimney is in the front of the house and it's very prominent in the front of the house.
Becomes part of the style feature, whereas in the Victorian it was kind of hidden. What else do you notice going on with all those buildings that I just kind of flashed through? There's some asymmetry, yeah, absolutely. We didn't go back to that strict adherence to balance that we had in the pre-Victorian period.
It's a vertical accent, but not ornate.
Modesty in design. That, yeah, we have height, we have in some cases width, but those elaborate porches, they're not as elaborate anymore. That decorative work, stickwork, brickwork in the gable ends, we're putting some of it in there, but it's not going to be nearly as decorative. It's not going to be nearly as kind of a wedding cake on crack, if you want. It's going to be much more subdued, and that's going to be the main features as we move into the 20th century, a modesty. We don't have to stick everything on a single building anymore. We can pick and choose. We can have more earthy forms. And we start to see this with the Tudor style. Now, obviously, we're kind of harkening back into the old medieval days, castles and knights and the small medieval cottages. But again, I just have to point out that lack of overdoing it, that lack of showing off everything that you can just because you can. So the Tudor form, one of the first things you might notice about it is that in especially these vernacular forms, like we have, these are examples from St. Paul, there's no porch on. Instead of a porch, you have this double gable form. And in a lot of cases, you have this extremely swooping gable. I always kind of love this form because it's so dramatic. The smaller gable, typically like a porch entryway, a sort of a sort of foyer where you can shade your umbrella. Well, you don't really want to do that in the house, but you know, you can take off your overcoat. And you're already in the building, but you're not quite into the main part of the house. But then you get past that and you're in the main part of the house. But that double gable form is very typical of the Tudor form. And you pointed out that the chimneys are now very prominent. That was one of the main features of a Tudor form. I put that in number 3. But that chimney becomes kind of a showpiece. We aren't putting the gable ends and the porch detail on there, so why not just kind of gussy up one of the more functional elements of the house? So that chimney becomes the focal point. It becomes the height element on the building that really makes it stand out. Some other features that we start to see now that we really hadn't seen in the Victorian period, we've got multi-pane over single-pane windows. Now, you can express those mathematically by counting the number of panes in the upper part of the window and counting the number of panes in the lower part. So in this case, you've got an 8/1 window. And that's kind of the technical expression. It just indicates that there are 8 panes of glass in the upper portion and then a single in the lower. If you were my students, I would quiz you on that, but you know, just remember that you can express these things at a ratio, and it tells you, it's a little bit more of a descriptive method to describe that window itself. The batten door, you'll notice that the wood slats are, they're more vertical than horizontal. No paneling, really, just a small window. This is kind of a feature of the Tudor revival, or I'm sorry, the Tudor house. You don't find these on a lot of other buildings. You're not going to find them on Victorians pretty much at all. You might find them on a few other arts and crafts styles, but they're really kind of, especially if it's paired with that arch, that's really one of the main features of the Tudor door. It's really trying to kind of bring you back to those castles, those dark, dingy medieval castles. As is the stonework around doorways. See a little bit of the stonework around here. This just has a stone lintel above it. I think this one, also in the Highland Park area in St. Paul, this is a great example of that decorative stonework. Now, like I was saying, a Tudor house can be high style, and you can do a lot of different things with it. You can add a porch if you want to. You can add half timbering. In this case, that's what that is, the half timbering, where you can see exposed beams and stucco. And you can pretty much do what you want. You can have different types of gables on there. But the vernacular forms tended to follow this plan: the double gable, the steep gable, the multi-pane over single-pane windows, and a prominent chimney. Nice later. Okay, so we do see some examples of this in commercial architecture. Now, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes a Tudor versus kind of this Alpine look as well. It's more or less, doesn't look like something you would find in an old English village. And in this case, we have some very prominent gables. We've got that half timbering again, very steep gables. Trying to differentiate it between the sort of Alpine, the Elation, and the Tudor. Again, it's very difficult. What you would probably want to do is kind of take a look at what the original use was. But typically when I see half timbering and I see steep gables like this, I associate it with Tudor. So, and in this case it actually had, I'm afraid the picture got cut off, but it has a nice little castle tower to it too. Yes?
The word Tudor, does it have a connection to King Henry VIII?
You know, it actually, the style itself, the elements of style that have been carried over actually predate Henry VIII, but it was kind of named after the Tudor dynasty. So yeah, you made that connection. Tudor, some people say that it's more Elizabethan, but you know, the little English cottage, it predates the Tudor dynasty. It's tough to say. There were no Tudors left at this point, so they're just kind of harkening back to a time when we knew of the grand traditions of the medieval. So personally, I'm a big Henry VIII fan, or I love reading about him and stuff, so it is kind of nice to see that that tradition has been kept alive. Now, the craftsman home, I'm sure you've seen 1,000 of these in your community. Okay, hands up. How many of you have craftsmen in your community? Okay, I am not seeing pretty much any hands down or anybody who's not nodding at this point. The craftsman is one of the predominant styles because this was more or less a kit house. This is one of those houses that was cataloged. You could just pick it out of your pattern book, send away for it. In California, they were building these all over the place. You could actually go to Sears and pick out your house and have it built very quickly. But it always strikes me that the Craftsman home, for as almost modular as they were, they have some of the most exquisite craftsmanship on the inside. The built-ins, the woodworking, the columns, the room separations. It's a very different form than even the Tudor, even the Victorian forms. The interior floor plan tends to be significantly more open than Victorian houses. They don't tend to differentiate the rooms quite as much. They might put like a built-in bookcase or something, or some tall columns to differentiate the space, but the floor plan is much more open than anything that predates it. Of course, we're going to open it up even further with the ranches and ramblers, but at this point, this was a great way to sort of get the house almost as a single unit room on the lower levels. Now you'll notice with the Craftsman, again, we have that modest decor. We're not going to decorate it up. We're not going to put the turn post and the spindle work and the decorative gable ends on there. You might have some half timbering. You might have some decorative brickwork, but overall the form is going to be much less ornate. It's not going to have that overdone look to it. So you've got the modest decor. You've got bracketed eaves, and the brackets are, actually if we just go ahead one, the brackets are what's referred to as the knee bracket, and you'll notice the difference between that and what we saw with the Italianates earlier. Remember the Italianates, they were just curvy and highly decorative and just artistically amazing. These have a much more functional look to them, a much more streamlined look. It's that modesty of form that's sort of toning it down almost. So the Craftsman detail work on the brackets is much more modest. You again have the multi-pane over single pane windows, but you'll notice in this case that the panes in the upper level, in the upper part of the window, much more narrow and tall instead of the square panes that we're used to from just about every other era in the past. And the 3/1 window was very popular. Up here we've got the 5/1. And these are going to be one of the ways that you can tell if your house has retained original windows. Most of the Craftsmen are going to have that type of window. So if you still see the 3/1, the 5/1, you might be able to say with reasonable certainty, not 100% until you do your research, but reasonable certainty that the windows are original to the building. Another thing you'll notice too is that we've gotten away from those light, delicate turn posts that we saw with the Victorian vernacular and the Queen Anne. Now we're getting into these heavy, thick, dense-looking posts. They're typically going to be made out of brick. They're going to have stucco, and they're going to be squared up. They're not going to have that delicate, light look to them anymore. They're going to be extremely heavy. And if we go back, you can see that on these buildings from St. Paul and Mankato. It's not unusual to have a different material being used on the foundation level than it is on the main level. So you've got a combination of like stone and wood. In this case, they've actually enclosed the porch. I think that might have been an original enclosure, but it's just brick all the way up. In this case, they actually kind of made it a little bit more creative. They put, it's an entirely stucco kind of pilaster. It's not a freestanding column, but they've added little nooks in here for pots of plants or whatever they wanted to put in there, and they added a little bit of decorative detail. So it's not like it's completely void of decoration. You can still play with it, but it's more modest.
Can you speculate on why that shift to so much brick and stucco away from the wood framing of so much of the Victorian?
Just to speculate, my guess is that it was probably easier to get mass-produced locally, perhaps. Honestly, that industry is something I haven't looked into a whole lot, so I'm afraid I can't speculate too much. But I would also imagine that it had to do with fashion, that these houses were, even though they were kind of modular houses, it was kind of the fashionable thing to use the stucco and get a more smooth look instead of the traditional wood slab. It's not to say that wood cladding wasn't being used, But this was just kind of a way to make your house a little bit more distinctive, a little bit more permanent looking, a little bit more earthy. Craftsman houses are about looking earthy and modest, and so by using those kind of less produced materials, then you have a more earthy look. So, but again, I'm just speculating. Okay, so at this time, we're seeing some revolutions in architectural form, making sure we don't go over. We're seeing Frank Lloyd Wright coming out of Chicago. We already saw Louis Sullivan come and go. They were trying to get us away from those heavy Victorian forms. And so we see the prairie style emerging from Chicago. We see it in Frank Lloyd Wright's houses. And because of the popularity and his infamous styles and forms, I'm not going to go over those. But I am going to talk about the sort of derivative of the Frank Lloyd Wright form. And that would be, I guess you could call it like the pseudo-prairie or the four-square. The prairie style is all about the horizontal line. It's all about the wide eaves and sort of bringing the house back to earth. Well, there was an acceptance of that, but there was still a mindset that we like to have height in our buildings. So they were kind of melding some of the Frank Lloyd Wright horizontal emphasis with a good-sized house. Remember, we're still coming off of the Queen Anne era where you wanted the height and you wanted the elaborate detail on the vertical plane. So what we find is that with the four squares, you have something that's very, very similar to an Italianate. You have a very squared-off floor plan. Again, you can add wings and you can add extensions, but we find that there's a little bit of difference between this and the Italianate. In the Italianate, the eaves really hugged the building, and they were supported by these elaborate brackets. In the prairie, or pseudo-prairie and four-square, we have wide-hanging eaves, still on hipped roof, but there really aren't those elaborate brackets. You might have some knee brackets, but in a lot of cases, you're just going to have the eaves overhanging the building as wide as you could get them, just to create that sort of horizontal plane. The porches are going to be very similar to what we saw with the Craftsman. They're going to be earthen materials, the stucco, the brick, stone in some cases. They typically wouldn't wrap around like you see in the Mankato example. They would most often be more like the Savannah, Georgia example. They would be the squared posts. They would be the sort of trapezoidal posts that you see up here with some sort of pedestal on them. The prairies or pseudo-prairies and four squares would be the multi-pane over single-pane windows. So we see a lot of similarities between the Craftsman style and the prairie style, but the Craftsman style tended to use the gable roof. The side gable was very popular in this region, although I have seen some front gables, but the prairie style tended to use the hip roof, and that's really how you differentiate those two styles. So prairie style has the hipped roof with broadly overhanging eaves, but the same thing. You got a modest decoration, you've got modest detail on the building. Sometimes you would add a little bit of artwork just to make yourself look good, but for the most part, you kept it very simple. As for commercial vernacular, well, if you were in the last session, you already kind of know this stuff. We're starting to move into this modernist movement. We're starting to see a little bit less detail on the facade. We're not putting those big iron columns on there. We're not putting those big iron arches anymore. We're opening up the glass. We're making the glass panels larger. We're trying to make sure that everybody can see pretty much everything in your store. We're starting to see some streamlining in the cornice detail. The upper levels, they're not using that Italianate cornice line anymore. We're not using brackets, and we're not using a lot of arches on there. We're using brickwork to create the detail, and it's going to be kind of modest in its form. Even in some of the larger buildings, you see that they're not using the Greek columns on the exterior. You're using some dentils. There's your decoration. Just a simple form. You're emphasizing the contents of the building instead of the building itself. Now, I'm not going to say that that's 100% of the case. If you go into Chicago, the Carson Carey Scott building, and that thing's like all over the place. It's a gorgeous building. But in the non-Chicago commercial vernaculars. In the smaller towns like Franklin, Virginia here, the decoration will be on the upper levels, but it's going to be more in the form of brick parapets, like up there, and it's going to be in the use of glass. But you know, the Art Deco, the modern, the modernistic, if you were in the last session, again, you already know quite a bit about this. The Art Deco became extremely popular. This was that city efficient look. This was an efficiency of form, an efficiency of style. Instead of using like floral swags on your building, you're going to hint at them by using a series of geometric forms. Art Deco is all about geometry. Squares, triangles, rectangles, and how you can arrange them to sort of suggest other things. You're not going to show a tree on the building. You're not going to show some sort of a carving of a tree. You're going to show like a single rectangle with 4 little triangles surrounding it that sort of suggest a tree. The Art Deco movement is all about suggestion, geometry, and height. And you can see that in some of these examples here. In Albuquerque, you've got, I'm assuming that was a theater at one point, it's kind of derelict now, but you've got that single tower in the center that dominates the whole building. It has no functional purpose, but it creates that height by using nothing more than a series of rectangles. Minneapolis, you've got the AT&T building, and this one's a little bit harder to see, but if you're actually up next to that building, you can see very clearly how they use the squares and the rectangles to kind of create this tiered look to the building. Even in Denver, you can see that series of kind of geometric form creating a really great parapet, but if you look at it closely, it's all just shapes. It's all just the triangles, rectangles, and squares. I love the Beacon News though, because this is what we see a lot in our communities. These Art Deco buildings put into the traditional downtown commercial lot, which of course is long and narrow, but you still see that sort of vertical focus, that use of the rectangle in an arrangement that creates visual height, if not physical height. So the Art Deco, Art Moderne movement, actually if you go out on 4th Street on Faribault and look off to your left as you're headed back to the highway, you're going to see some of that in some of the government buildings along that street, so pay attention to it. I think the Rice County building is Art Deco. And we're heading into territory that's been covered extensively at this conference, so I won't talk too much about it. But I did want to mention the international style, because a lot of us have these in our communities. It's a very boxy look. Personally, I'm only starting to appreciate the historic value of these buildings, and I'm finding that a lot as I talk to people. But now we're starting to notice the ribbon windows, these long unbroken strands of windows. And the heavy use of concrete, steel, and glass. You create what's known as the curtain wall. The curtain wall is an exterior support wall that allows the thrust of the building to really be focused on the exterior, so you can have a lot of open interior space. What I love too is the use of these colored panels. I mean, that just gives a little bit of extra emphasis to the building that we don't see in the other forms. The Art Deco movement, that was starting to get into these this use of color, but the high style Art Deco tended to use black, gold, black, bronze, black, silver. I mean, these were dark and kind of dramatic, almost like Hollywood-esque colors. But now with the mid-century movement, we're starting to see all the colors being used, as you can see with the bright red on the TWA headquarters building. Now, a lot of times there isn't going to be a real big emphasis on vertical. It's mostly going to be a horizontal emphasis. Of course, that's not 100% of the time, but we do see quite a bit of it. Now, in the last session, we were told that Googie isn't really the preferred term by everybody. Personally, I can't think of anything else to call it other than maybe sci-fi. This actually was inspired quite a bit by the sci-fi popular culture of the time. I mean, you think Buck Rogers and you think of the space race, and it had a lot of influence on what we were doing with our architectural forms. So you've got these exaggerated lines. You've got these kind of Jetsons-like buildings going up all over the place. You have these large cantilever extensions coming out of the building. Some of them are even unsupported, which I find absolutely remarkable. This is why I'm not an engineer. I would have no idea how to do that. But they extended out. They provided shelter for people who were lounging or getting gas or whatever they were doing underneath there. But they created just this great visual emphasis on the building. You also have what's known as the butterfly roof. And you can kind of see why it's called the butterfly roof. But look at that exaggeration. Look at how it sort of creates this book-like form and really creates a roof line we haven't seen before. Then over in Fayetteville, looks like that building's been abandoned for a little while, but that curvature to the roof and that extended roof line, that's just unusual. This is a very Googie form. It's very science fiction. If you think you can see it on the Jetsons, you're probably looking at Googie. And I have to point out this sign here. We're starting to include signs in our historic designations. Well, we're not starting to. I think we always have. But the Googie signs, the sci-fi signs from the 50s are starting to come into acknowledgement. And the one for Duttler's Bowl in Mankato, this is one of only 17 surviving rotating sphere signs in the United States. It doesn't work anymore. There are only 7 of them that actually do. But it is a unique resource. And I don't imagine that's on the National Register yet, is it?
Nope.
This one needs to be on the National Register because it is a very unique element and something that Minnesota only has one of. So, but the Googie form really is that sort of hats off to science fiction. But I really, really love this form. And this is something that we haven't really seen in the modern sessions. And that's the mimetic. This one is really born of the highway movement. As people were traveling in their cars, they wanted to be able to advertise to the folks who were just traveling down Route 66. So you make your building noticeable. How do you make it noticeable? You make it look like another type of object. So there is no end to creativity when it comes to the mimetic form. Pretty obvious what this company sells. Some of you might have some of these. I can't imagine you would think that they sold hot dogs or ice cream or anything. King Cone, this is a pineapple plant. I mean, it's a great way to advertise in your communities. But I really love this one. This is still a conceptual rendering. This is George Lucas's office headquarters. Now, if you are familiar with the Star Wars series, the Sandcrawler in the first one with the Jawas running all over the place, he's making his corporate headquarters look like that. And even though it's a very modern building using the reflective glass, it's very clearly mimetic because he's directly referring to one of his own creation. So that's where we're going to take it. We're just about out of time here. This thought I'd leave you with. Yeah, this was an actual structure. Mankato had one of these for quite some time until they probably realized it was more or less a death trap. This is why I was saying there are no rules. There are no rules in architecture. You're going to find Tudor mixed with Italianate. You're going to find that architects love to play. And so I wanted to leave you with this thought too. I'm just kind of giving you the appetizer sampler. As Mike mentioned, I am developing continuing education classes that you can get continuing education credit for. They're online at MSU. So far I've got the pre-Victorian, Victorian sessions done, arts and crafts and mid-century modern are coming. But I go more in depth into the background of the styles, the elements of the styles, and I give many, many more examples. So if you're interested, there's some contact information, and I can give you my card afterwards as well. And I thank you all for being here, and I hope you can get some